Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of the award-winning Everything Compliance. We are absolutely thrilled today to have two guest panelists, returning Karen Moore, and also first-time guest panelist Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard and Reed. Mike, first of all, welcome.
Thank you, Tom, and to this group. I'm honored to be here.
And Karen, welcome back.
Thank you.
So Mr. Armstrong is not here, so we're going to start in the continental United States with Matt Kelly. Matt, what is on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. So what is on my mind is the plight of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That is one of the country's primary banking regulators here in the United States. And last week, the FDIC released a report about its deeply flawed corporate culture. And there are many, many lessons here for corporate compliance professionals. We can get into those. But the history is that for the better part of about 20 years, the FDIC has been plagued with a culture of sexual harassment, office bullying, racial harassment, other toxic cultures, whistleblower retaliation, of course, and a general lack of accountability. The FDIC had been struggling with that since the mid-2000s, and this came to a head last fall when the Wall Street Journal published a really scathing, in-depth article about the problems at the FDIC, which of course led to the requisite hand-wringing and gnashing of teeth in Washington, where the FDIC, which is run by a board of 5 governors who are they're all appointed by the president, and most of them are also heads of other financial regulators in Washington. But the FDIC Board of Governors commissioned an internal investigation to be done by an external provider, the law firm Cleary Gottlieb. And Cleary's report came out last week, 234 pages. It is not good. They documented all sorts of problems, some really awful personal behavior from managers. But I think the interesting threads for compliance officers to pull on are how this corporate culture not only got so bad, but then stayed bad, because managers at the FDIC knew that they had a culture problem clearly since at least the financial crisis. That was 16 years ago, 2008. They had been trying to correct the culture, allegedly, but not doing it. And even as recently as right now, when that law firm, Cleary Gottlieb, established an external anonymous hotline for the FDIC's 6,000-ish employees to come and report their allegations of misconduct, harassment, whatever. 6,000 employees, they got 500 calls from separate employees. So that's nearly 10% of the company called at a special dedicated anonymous hotline within the course of a couple of months since November. And this problem had gone on for 20 years. So that really is why compliance officers should look at these problems here. What intrigued me most was thinking about corporate culture risk. Sure, compliance officers want to worry about that at your own organizations. How would you actually step back and assess that risk? And I have written about this in a couple of different posts now. My first pass at this was actually, I think we would be remiss, all organizations would be remiss, if you're assessing the risks of a flawed corporate culture, step back and actually say, what is the fundamental structure of our organization? And what is its mission? How is it set up? Because when you look at the FDIC, it is a highly decentralized organization. It has 8 regional offices and then a couple of dozen field offices throughout the United States. And that's the structure of it. On the personnel side, it really works like almost a college campus. You have tenured employees who are known as commissioned examiners for the FDIC. And then you have non-commissioned, more junior examiners. They get years of training, but really their success within the FDIC depends upon the approval of the commissioned people. So much like a college campus, you're really not going to get tenure if you're an adjunct professor if the tenured people don't like you. At the same time, the mission of the FDIC, it is there to assess the stability of banks. So you're spending a lot of time on the road. Or if the bank is insolvent, The FDIC swoops in at 4:58 p.m. on a Friday. They spend a weekend restructuring the bank, packaging it off to be resold to a larger, healthier bank that reopens at 9:01 a.m. on a Monday. So you're spending all weekend in close quarters with these senior people. Very insular culture, very patriarchal culture. Those are the words that the Cleary Gottlieb report found. So it just struck me that, well, what else did we think was going to happen with a culture like that? When you have a small group of longtime employees with enormous power over a larger group of more transitional, up and coming employees, and you're spending a lot of time in close quarters, of course you are at high risk of people doing stupid things. Either a booze-filled culture, which was one problem, or inappropriate managers, another problem. So there's a lot of that, just thinking through how do you assess culture risk. Then the other thing that I wanted to pull on here was that Cleary Gottlieb did a root cause analysis, and Jonathan Marks, I know you're a big fan of the root cause analysis. So Cleary Gottlieb identified 10 root causes, which I don't even know. Is that a lot? Is that too few? I get that most companies with problems have multiple root causes. 10 seems like a lot. But the very first root cause that Cleary Gottlieb identified was a lack of accountability. I thought about that too, because that is probably a chronic complaint at a lot of dysfunctional organizations, except I'm not sure lack of accountability is that a cause or is that a symptom of other causes? Because really, when you think about it, some of the other root causes at the FDIC were sloppy record keeping, so you couldn't double check that discipline is consistent, conflicting policies and internal reporting channels when somebody has to report harassment or wants to. Maybe you're going to report one type of harassment to the wrong channel, and then you don't have the protections you thought. They were focusing on, let me see, I pulled up a list here. Some of the other ones were investigative functions that were poorly designed. You are reporting a complaint to the same team that then investigates the complaint, which actually works for central administration. So you have to question whether that team investigating your complaint is independent. Failure by management to talk about the appropriateness or the importance of internal reporting. A risk-averse institution. I thought that was really quite telling that a lot of the managers there, when they were confronted with a problem, and maybe you should have employee discipline, they were more afraid of, if we take action, will this lead to a big, messy litigation mess with the offending employee, versus what's the risk of not taking any action? Well, the risk of not taking any action is employees thinking nothing gets done. So there's no accountability. And it was just an interesting reminder that when we talk about lack of accountability, which we talk about in ethics and compliance all the time, it's not really a problem unto itself. It is the result of other problems and other choices management makes that often are very practical. You have the sloppy channels, you have the poorly structured investigations, bad record keeping. Those are not things that just kind of come up out of nowhere. You choose to allow a lot of these problems, and then, like a ghost out of the machine, along comes lack of accountability. It's not a problem unto itself. It is the result of other problems companies deliberately decide to live with. And I mean, I could keep on going, as most people could figure out by now, but the FDIC is going to be a fascinating case study for ethics and compliance people who worry about corporate culture.
Karen, you have a question or comment for Matt?
I do. Matt, first of all, thanks for parsing that many pages of the report, because it really is rich and ripe, but also long to read. I do have a question, and because the FDIC is such a decentralized organization, and you always run the risk in that kind of a structure of microcultures, which then create potential benefits and also more often potential problems. How do you handle compliance and these microcultures? How do you get a handle on those, and what do you do about them?
Well, I've thought about that from time to time, even separate from the FDIC, because I do think we sometimes overlook the important point that within a large organization, you will have a culture of something, compliance, retaliation, harassment, high ethics. But within various fiefdoms, there are going to be subcultures, and that is okay to some extent. But one thing I think that we miss is that we don't study what is the natural likelihood of subcultures emerging. And if you don't have a good sense of that at the top, at the senior management level, senior management won't really know. Therefore, how much should we, as the senior leaders, lean in on the importance of some enterprise-wide cultural traits? You do not need a policy or a culture of celebrating everybody's birthday with a cake. The accounting team wants to do that, or the UK team wants to do that. Strikes me as kind of weird, but it's just cake. Knock yourselves out. Those kind of differences are okay, but it is not okay to have retaliation in one place, but not another. So you do need to think about it. Certainly, it raises the idea of having compliance ambassadors. I think that's a good practice. But also, you might then want to think about what are some of the more tangible, practical policies that you could have to fight the wrong subcultures erupting. Maybe something like rotating more senior officers through these offices from time to time. Maybe something around pay and promotion and tying that to a strong whistleblower culture in each office. Exit interviews and doing careful data analytics to be able to see that we seem to have a lot of complaints or high rates of turnover at these subcultures, but not these other ones. Why not? So yes, I think one of the low-hanging fruits that we grasp for are the compliance ambassadors that compliance officers like to talk about. I think that they are a fine program if you want, but I still am. One of the big lessons that struck me with the FDIC is how much a lot of the antidote measures are just practical HR sort of stuff that you could think about. Rotating senior employees, pay and promotion procedures, exit interviews, sentiment surveys, things like those are things that you can do. Those are mechanical, really. It's not just about senior managers getting up on a soapbox and exhortations for good corporate culture. Those are good. Those are important. But if you do all of that without the practical stuff, then who cares? The practical stuff matters. And it was glaring to see how much it mattered with this long-term problem at the FDIC.
We haven't had a full episode that was entitled the Rant Edition, but I feel that coming on. Matt, I want to change the focus a little bit to ask you about the congressional hearings that happened this week. Was there anything you heard or saw in any of that other than the standard banking committee ranting? Was there anything a compliance professional could take away from those hearings that they could actually incorporate into their program, or was it just theater?
I mean, it wasn't entirely theater, although certainly there's a lot of theatrics. It was interesting to see that some Democrats were ranting specifically against Martin Gruenberg. He is the chairman of the FDIC. He has been a senior executive there for the better part of 20 years. His leadership was called out in this Cleary-Gottlieb report, where they said that many employees found him to be unapproachable, grouchy, vitriolic. That was one adjective. Prone to outbursts, not somebody who likes to hear bad news, shoot the messenger sort of a leader. So Mr. Gruenberg was the one who went before the House committees, and he did not have a fun time there. Lots of Republicans have been calling for him to resign. Key question is whether Democrats will actually call for him to resign, which if they do, I think you can put a fork in his career at the FDIC. They didn't call for him to resign, but a lot of them did say like some really unflattering stuff. He is clearly on some very thin ice there, perhaps not undeservedly so. But he didn't say he was going to resign. And as a practical matter, if he does resign, the thing for compliance officers in the banking sector is that's going to gum up the work of banking regulatory policy, at least until 2025. Because if he goes, there's a 4-4 partisan split, and we ain't doing anything on big banking regulatory policy until that split gets resolved by having a new FDIC chairman. Maybe it'll be Joe Biden who gets reelected, puts a new chairman in. Maybe it'll be Donald Trump. Who knows who he might put in at the FDIC, but that Republican-led commission will go in a very different direction. So if Grunenberg leaves, that will have big implications for some pending banking regulatory policies. I don't think it will have anything really, no other significant lessons for compliance officers overall. But if you're in banking, you might want to watch this and see what happens. I don't know if he's going to resign or not. It seems like he is one big pile of bad news away from being forced out the door. I'm not sure if there's I don't know what else could be worse for the FDIC, but bad agencies continue to impress me. Who knows what might be coming next?
All right, we'll move to one of our guest panelists, Karen Moore. Karen, you got interested in a Court of Appeals decision on a Title VII and Equal Protection Clause case regarding DEI training. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, I've been itching to talk about this decision ever since it came out in March. And it sort of vaguely crosses over with something Matt said that came out of the FDIC report, and that is, how investigations are done on the intake and follow-up method. So in this case, we've got Joshua Young, who worked at the Department of Corrections in Colorado. By all accounts, a high performer, promoted a couple of times. He filed a complaint with the Department of Corrections, informing them that some DEI training that he had taken was racially biased. But he was told by the Department of Corrections that his claim had no foundation and would not be investigated. It was not taken any further, and Young subsequently quit and filed an action and lost in the first instance and lost in the second instance as well. So he sued both the Department of Corrections and the Office of Health Equity, which was the source of the training at issue. Young filed the case based on two different theories. One was under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and the other claiming violations of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, he lost on the U.S. Constitution one on completely procedural grounds. So we're going to really want to focus a little bit more on Title VII, even though that the substance of this case, which is very worth reading, is actually not the point that ultimately I want to make. But in any event, he claimed that the complaint centered around this one-time mandatory online training, and that the training contained sweeping negative generalizations, race-based, as did the additional reading. And this created this hostile environment such that he felt it was covered by Title VII, and his termination, or his voluntary termination, his decision to quit, was based on harassment arising out of this training. Now, I'm going to add one. And this is all, I think, for any compliance officer, something that excites all of us. It's like, oh my God, we've got, kind of racially offensive training. It's really bad. Somebody's complained about it. We've got to do something about it. Why didn't they do anything about it? I want to add one extra fact, and I want everybody listening to check their own immediate reaction and what your reaction would have been having received this complaint, which is that Joshua Young is white. And all of his claims were that the training was creating a hostile environment, that it was racially based, and therefore his employment terms at the Department of Correction were fundamentally changed because of this race-based training. So check your own initial reaction, because I want to come back to it at the end. So the court took a look at the training itself. It was a modular training developed by the Office of Health Equity. It was based along the principles that office in Colorado had established for various state enterprises, including the Department of Corrections. Young said that the training itself contained so much race-based, anti-white sentiment that he felt that there was not only harassment per se, but also the potential for safety issues arising from the training itself. So the training scenarios, which aren't really discussed in detail, but one can imagine what they might look like, also included additional materials, additional reading materials, including White Fragility and some other books that many of us may have read in the course of our interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in our organizations. And there was additional reading and additional videos. There is a glossary that was created by the Office of Health Equity, which contained definitions of a number of terms, including white fragility, white exceptionalism, which is defined as something that says that people who are trying to be allies to underrepresented classes themselves are incapable of becoming allies. Race is defined in that glossary as a social construct designed to justify oppression of people of color by whites, and other tools and reading. So I have to say, in this case, the court did not look favorably on the training and the related materials at all. And it actually went so far as conjecturing that an ongoing commitment to this similar type of training could evolve into a hostile workplace claim, as could requiring government employees to endorse an ideological platform or risk losing their jobs. In this case, however, Young fails to demonstrate that there was any concrete consequences of the training itself, that he was not himself harassed, that subjectively it may have been a violation, but that objectively there were really no grounds for him. He was not fired. He may have said that he felt that he was forced to resign, but there is no fact-based evidence that was submitted showing that he was in a position where he felt he needed to resign. And the court reiterated that under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, race-based harassment needs to be severe or pervasive, and it needs to change your employment conditions by creating an abusive work environment in which you're no longer capable of working. Young failed to really assert any facts there that would give the court any rise to give him satisfaction against the Department of Corrections, even though it seemed fairly sympathetic. And Young himself raises some great examples of prior cases where Title VII violations occurred based on comments, based on training, based on policy. So those are worth taking a look at as well. He just felt, he said that because he knew his colleagues were receiving similar training, that it could evolve into a hostile work environment and even safety issues in a very stressful and fraught work environment. His equal protection claims were not addressed because of his lack of standing. He was a government employee, but not at the time that he filed suit. He resigned before filing. So overall, I think this is a really interesting case. It really excited me when I first heard just the initial facts. And I have to fact check myself. And I'm interested, what others' initial reactions were, because as a compliance officer, when I hear, oh, there's a white guy in a prison who's complaining that the DEI training was anti-white, blah, 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 my first reaction was, oh, nothing there. And then I realized that this is exactly the kind of reaction that we can have that brings our own prejudices to the fore, even if not entirely consciously, because if you do not listen to people when they've got an issue, if you don't listen and respect people when they make the effort to raise a complaint and actually look into that complaint, you first of all miss the opportunity to correct things that may be going wrong. And if not, you miss the opportunity to educate the person, to make them feel heard, to have a conversation, make them see perhaps a different perspective than they started out with. So I think that not letting your own bias diminish your ability to investigate and correct is really something that is endemic, or something that is very tempting when you're a compliance officer who's overburdened possibly by complaints here. So, the Department of Corrections lost what it considered to be a high-performing individual. The court now has already kind of raised the specter of problems that one hopes the Office of Health Equity in Colorado will take a look at its own training and potentially address. And for compliance officers everywhere, listen when people are unhappy, even if you start with the assumption that they are wrong or they do not have anything worthy of listening to. So that is Young versus Department of Corrections and the Colorado Office of Health Equity. Couple of small learnings there.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
I do, actually. I think that this is a really important point that Karen brings up about listening to people even when they are challenging your preconceived notions. And I can take it in a very different and unfortunately darker direction, that here in New England, we were haunted by a case of a young girl, Haley Montgomery, who was beaten to death by her father, who was a violent criminal. And before that happened, this girl had disappeared and nobody knew where she was. This was in the early part of the 2020s, and the pandemic did not help. But the only person who was running around saying, wait a minute, a 5-year-old is missing, we need to find her, was her mother, who was homeless, a junkie, and had a criminal record herself, but she was not violent and she did love her daughter. And she was running around for a year looking at social service agencies, schools, police, trying to get anybody to listen to her, that my daughter seems to be missing. I fear the worst for her and her father. And of course, the worst happened, and her father was very recently convicted of murder and sentenced to, I think, the rest of his life in jail, which is exactly where he belongs. And it's easy when somebody raises a hotline complaint, when a Black person says, I'm suffering racism, when a woman says she's suffering sexual harassment, you listen to that because that fits what you would normally expect. But when a homeless junkie with a criminal record calls you up and spins out this crazy story about a missing kid for a year and how could that possibly happen, are we all sure that we would listen to that? Because I've been in the news business for a long time. I have had my share of crazy people call me up on the phone, spinning out all sorts of stuff. And it is a point that haunts me about, are we as ready as we like to think to hear complaints, even when they come from an unusual source and it's an unusual set of facts that challenges our preconceived notions? And like in New England, at least with that Haley Montgomery case, a lot of us, we screwed it up terribly. It does sound like this particular case, the guy didn't have much there, but that's not the issue. The issue is whether when somebody comes and calls you up that doesn't fit your expectations of what a complaint would be, are you still fully able to hear that objectively? And I think that maybe sometimes we delude ourselves about that.
Yeah, I think you're so on point there, Matt. And he may not have had a Title VII claim for harassment, but he certainly had some issues that he felt were important and valid enough to bring up internally with his organization. And the court didn't disagree with that.
Mike DeBernardis, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're as a group in agreement here that this is a kind of a good example of the issues that can arise when if we're sort of pigeonholing it, when the intake on a complaint is taking and bias isn't necessarily the perfect word here, but taking letting their own bias influence maybe how they react to that complaint. I think the tougher question is, as an organization, and Karen and Matt and everybody else, I'm curious for your thoughts, how do you combat that, right? Especially when you have a whistleblower program where you're maybe getting hundreds of complaints a day. How do you go about combating allowing the reviewer's own personal biases or an organization's biases influence how you react to those complaints?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Michael, because I know from experience that sometimes you get more complaints than you feel equipped to handle, and you've got to establish some very objective criteria. In my approach to investigations has always been, as long as there is an allegation that, if proven true, would violate our code of conduct or our related policies, we will investigate. The harder part comes when you've got somebody who's very unhappy about something that is not foursquare within the compliance code and policies, and you don't feel that you have other places for it to go in the organization, that maybe your HR team doesn't have an adequate intake and investigations procedure, or even your internal controls team, or that people feel really captive to the very people that might be investigating something, and you are equipped to do it, but you don't have the resources. What do you do? In this case, depending on how your organization is structured, I would say that most compliance teams would at least have a shared accountability for investigating anything that alleged race-based harassment or inappropriate mandatory training. And I hate to say it, but if it had been a Black person raising this exact same issue, most organizations would have been all over it.
Jonathan Marks, you have a question or comment for Karen? You're on mute, Jonathan.
Going back to the whole conversation about whistleblowers and reporting and listening to people, the biggest thing that I see in practice is that companies do not have, I think you were mentioning this, a robust allegation triage type of program. When a complaint or a comment comes in, where does it go? How does it get handled? But I will tell you that if you did not investigate everything, or at least pay attention to everything, that one time that you do not do that is the one time that it's going to come back to burn you. And then the last thing I want to talk about with this, we keep talking about intake. I'm a huge fan of outtake as well. When they're walking out the door, you better have a good exit strategy or exit interview process in place, because at that point in time, people are like, well, my fear is gone. My shtuss is out of me. I feel free to speak, as I wish. And there's no fear of repercussion because they're walking out the door. I think that's where a lot of organizations really do fall down. You get great information when people are walking out the door. And I think a lot of people miss that huge opportunity.
Yeah, I like both of those points, Jonathan. One is that once somebody raises a complaint, you're on notice. So completely ignoring it and failing to do at least an initial intake and a proper evaluation is dangerous for the organization. But it also, creates that lack of respect for the reporter who's bothered to speak up about something, and who may not have any basis for a claim at all, but should be heard and feel that they've been heard. And then that exit interview, that's a drum I've been banging for such a long time, because you get great information there, but you both get HR a little bit reluctant. And then I find that my legal colleagues sometimes also get head up about it. It's like, well, then the employee's in an adverse position the minute they walk out the door, and we shouldn't be talking to them. So yeah, everything's complicated.
Yeah.
All right, Jonathan Marks, I ask you to consider the new PCAO rules on auditor quality controls. What did you decide?
Yeah, before I get into this, I have to give a disclaimer that these are my opinions and not that of BDO, but and we'll talk about that. But overall, the new PCAOB standard on auditor quality controls, it's QC 1000, introduces this integrated risk-based framework to aim to improve, an audit firm's quality control systems. What does this sound like just by reading that? It sounds like, that the PCAOB is finally coming into, the current reality that the risk landscape has changed, and we need to kind of fix this a little bit and recalibrate or tune a little bit. Why the PCAOB decided to issue this new quality control standard? It was in response literally to significant changes in the audit environment and the deficiencies identified in audit engagements and quality control failures during inspections. they have taken the lead here, like we all should, and using that feedback that we're getting, that feedback loop to better the overall process. So I think, what they're trying to do and what they're aiming to do is they're doing the right things. There were 43 or so comment letters submitted, by various stakeholders, including accounting firms, investors, and academics, which generally, when I read it, indicate a positive outlook towards this new standard, emphasizing, I think, kind of its potential to enhance audit quality. And that's really what we're driving at, is to, we're the gatekeepers of the capital market, so to speak, as auditors. But I think overall the comments reflect that there was a collaborative effort, to ensure that the final standard effectively actually addressed the evolving needs, of the audit environment, balancing. There's a technology piece that flows into here too, but technological advancements and changing business practices with the need for rigorous audit quality control. Key elements of this, like I mentioned early on, but I'll kind of highlight them because I thought it was interesting when I went through and did my read. There's a risk assessment and management. Firms now are required to establish clear quality objectives, assess potential risks to these objectives, and respond appropriately to manage these risks. Again, this nomenclature that I'm going to say shouldn't be new to any of us. Monitoring and remediation. Again, words flowing out of the PCAOB now that, we've all been talking and bantering about for years and years and years. But there's a strong emphasis on ongoing monitoring now and a remediation process, which, help firms continuously evaluate and improve their quality control systems. All of this and a lot of this has been going on already. I think this just really formalizes it because I think, being in this environment for as long as I have, I know we're always trying to do better. And we're always trying to make sure that things are as complete and accurate as they possibly can. The third component of this is annual reporting. Audit firms must annually evaluate the effectiveness of their QC systems and report these evaluations to the PCAOB through a new non-public form that they have created. It's called Form QC. Here's a little bit of maybe a little bit of a twist for larger firms. And I don't know, this is kind of where I get a little bit on a, I'll talk about it and then we can talk about it together. But for larger firms, there's this external oversight now discussion that requires an external quality control function. They call it the EQ, I think the EQCF, to ensure independent judgment in evaluating the firm's quality control system. So, they're looking for sort of this external oversight for all of this, which I think is good. And it's not like that stuff hasn't been around for a while, but again, it's really formalizing and enhancing the overall process. And then I think the last thing that they actually kind of highlight and chunk out is, the technological and ethical standards and that set specific requirements for firms to use technology and align ethics and independence requirements, with those of the SEC and the PCAOB. So this standard goes into effect on December 15th of 2025. And its goal is to support, like I said, consistent high quality audits by adapting to the changing technological and business landscape, of the auditing practices that are around. But, in closing for today's discussion, and thank you for bringing up this topic, Tom, this marks to me, a pivotal advancement in the whole quality assurance process. Because again, I think, we've done a good job of articulating somewhat, what we're expecting of certain groups. And I think this is sort of right there with that, by addressing these gaps, in older standards and responding to these modern complexities of audit environments. This standard really does offer a structured, risk-based approach that promotes greater accountability and continuous improvement, which again, sounds like all the stuff that we talk about, all the time. I can't guarantee if it'll work or not. I don't know if there's going to be changes, but it does represent a significant step forward, safeguarding the integrity of financial reporting and enhancing investor confidence, making it a crucial update, I believe, for the audit industry. So that's my take on this QC 1000.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Jonathan?
I do have a question for you, Jonathan. So I see things like that standard, and I see other pronouncements from the PCAOB and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Like the PCAOB had an alert not long ago for how firms should be more skeptical or thoughtful about evidence produced by their clients or other third parties. Like it looks to me like generally the PCAOB is telling audit firms do better at our lofty goal of being skeptical about what is going on with your clients. And what is your take on that? Because for a lot of listeners who are at companies saying, well, this is cool, but what does it have to do with me? It's like, I suspect this is going to touch them eventually as the firms feel more pressure to, like I said, do better at being skeptical, high integrity firms that, look very askance at what people are telling them, which is an auditor's job.
I think that's a great point. I've spoken about skepticism over and over, and I've written about it as well. In the world of investigations, which is where I generally live in, we talk about the skepticism as being that sort of that kryptonite, if you will. When I actually lecture about this, I tell everyone, hey, from a white collar perspective, white collar criminals build a false sense of integrity around themselves because they want you to what them? And the answer is trust. And when you trust them, you lower your level of skepticism. So when you lower your level of skepticism, I think that's really where bad things really happen. And so, Matt, your points are right on. I think a lot of this really goes back to stuff that has been brought out by, I believe, the Center for Audit Quality has brought out this topic before about skepticism. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they've addressed it. I know that there have been articles written about it. But I think really fundamentally, after thinking about this and reading through this and coming up with my own independent conclusions, I came up with the same thing that, there's a couple key things in there that I think that from an auditing perspective, which I know a lot of the firms are doing, they're revamping and modifying their training, and they're calling folks out. But it also goes back to the fact that I believe that if somebody sees that there's something there has to be an avenue to respectfully make those comments, knowing that at some point you may disagree with somebody. And that's everybody loves great news, but they hate horrible news or when somebody goes against, whatever it is that they're thinking. And I think until we get to that, that human factor, so to speak, is always going to be a play here. And it's always going to be a risk. You could train everyone to the best they possibly can be, and they can know every FASB or, pronouncement that's out there. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to the human and the human in the loop, so to speak. And if that human in the loop is not applying the right level of skepticism when they're evaluating, audit evidence or looking at an accrual or an estimate or things like that, or an interpretation of an accounting pronouncement, it may not be as complete and accurate as it should be. So I think, the human element of this really is something that I hope is on folks' radar. I hope that the training has been modified because we've done it for internal audit. We've done it, or we're trying to do it for compliance. I think we're in that swim now. And, from an auditing perspective, if you look at where they fit in the whole ecosystem of all of this, I think it's right for that. I think that discussion is definitely ripe. And I think that your comments are spot on, but, you're not going to eliminate that at all. It can't be eliminated. It can be controlled. It can be monitored. It can be evaluated. It can be challenged. But eliminating, folks for not applying the right level of skepticism, that's a tough one.
Mike DeBernardis, as everyone knows, in March, the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco announced a new DOJ whistleblower incentive program and put the DOJ on a sprint to get policy released. We've had some information on that policy. Mary Inman, who is a whistleblower representing lawyer, has visited with us on this topic. But I wanted to bring you on because you and your colleagues at Hughes Hubbard do corporate investigations, white collar investigations, sometimes FCPA. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think this new DOJ policy will mean for in-house compliance professionals and outside counsel like yourself in terms of your investigation or anything else that might be on your mind?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to address your points first, but there is something else related that's on my mind, and that's the even more recent pilot program to encourage for voluntary self-disclosure by individuals, which I think the two things running parallel to each other could have major implications for companies dealing with allegations internally. But so the whistleblower program you're referencing, which is the full details kind of TBA, really appears to be designed to fill in some gaps. There's a patchwork of whistleblower programs out there now at the SEC and CFTC and others. And there's a feeling that there are certain types of allegations, certain types of whistleblowers that maybe that weren't covered by those programs, and this was meant to fill those gaps. It's also, I think, just consistent with the last few years of policy adjustments that the DOJ has made to more efficiently learn of potential misconduct, right? The most efficient way to learn of potential misconduct is to have people come and tell you about it. And so there's been a lot of emphasis over the last couple of years on finding ways to encourage companies to disclose misconduct themselves. And of course, this is an effort to get individuals to disclose it themselves. So I think if we're talking about the monetary sort of whistleblower rewards program, one of the from a compliance professional, from an in-house perspective, I think one of the issues it raises for me is the impact that this type of program can have on an internal whistleblower program, right? Because companies for decades really have been slowly trying to implement internal programs to get employees comfortable. Please report known or suspected allegations of misconduct internally, and we will take care of them. We'll take care of it efficiently. We'll address your problems. We'll address your concerns. And this program that the DOJ is announcing, and similar to the SEC program, provides a really potentially large incentive for employees to skip that and to go outside that chain and go directly to the department and say, here's my allegation. I can actually make some money off of this now, right? And I think that puts a burden on companies to do something that's really difficult, and that is to create a culture internally where employees feel a desire to cooperate with the organization itself because they're part of that organization, and to create a culture of reporting and whistleblowing where employees are really, despite where the incentives may lie, are feel an obligation to report internally first. I did want to talk briefly about the voluntary disclosure program, because I think the two things together also put significant pressure on internal investigations and the timing of those things. So the voluntary disclosure program, which the criminal division announced, offers the carrot of a non-prosecution agreement for individuals who basically tell on themselves and their company, right? So people, a whistleblower program is at least as announced, will exclude people who are actually involved in misconduct. The voluntary disclosure program is designed for them. Come to us if you have done something wrong. We have the carrot here of a non-prosecution agreement if this information is unknown to us, and you're going to cooperate and testify against other wrongdoers, including the company, and take some other steps. We will potentially not prosecute you. So that's also a very big incentive. There's no monetary reward, but it's a big incentive. But the implication, I think, for companies responding to allegations of misconduct are really profound in some ways, because the DOJ in particular has been making tweaks to its policies to encourage self-disclosure by companies and to encourage it to happen quickly, right? So There's a lot of time pressure already built into the system. If you want to get credit for voluntary disclosure, you have to make your disclosure quickly. We saw this in the FCPA context with the Albemarle case. I think Albemarle ultimately disclosed within 16 months of learning of the misconduct after having conducted an investigation, and the DOJ decided that wasn't fast enough, right? So that pressure was already there, but now with these two components combined, with this whistleblower program and the voluntary disclosure program for individuals, you have a potential race to the department, right? I got to be the first one in the door. And particularly for this voluntary disclosure program, you could run the risk of, you get an allegation internally, you start an investigation, and now if the wrongdoer within the company learns of your investigation, they know the facts, right? They already know that they've committed wrongdoing. You're behind the ball because you have to investigate to really justify the allegation, and they can beat you to the DOJ. You can be moving as fast as you want, but if they learn of your investigation, they could beat you in the door to be the one who actually discloses this issue, and now you've missed out on your opportunity for self-disclosure. So it really amps up the time pressure. It creates some interesting issues in terms of how to structure an investigation, and especially in the early stages, to try to do it as quietly as possible, to not tip off internal folks that you're doing it, with the risk that they may go running to the DOJ before you've substantiated the allegations, and puts pressure on compliance professionals to create and the organization overall, to create a culture where employees want to be part of the organization and help the organization by keeping their allegations internal rather than sort of first instinct knee-jerk reaction to go out external.
Mike, in terms of, I'm going to pitch this to Jonathan Marks because he talks about triage as well as anyone I know. But in terms of triage, does this really ramp everything up now that even if it's a suspicion of something that may be beyond just the routine, they've got to pick up the phone and call outside counsel? We've heard the Department of Justice or Kenneth Polite talk about the need for speed and self-disclosures. Do those factors really ramp all this up together in a way that we haven't seen?
Well, I think that's a good question. And I think the real, just to add on there, there's a fundamental difference between an internal investigation and an independent investigation. And, as you triage an allegation, the farther you get up the food chain within a company, if you're dealing with a senior leader or some critical issue or a board member, whatever, those require independent investigations. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here is more independent investigations. And, it does ramp this up. I mean, there's always, and I'm sure Mike will agree with me, there's a lot of pressure on me as an investigator, as a forensic CPA, to get to answers more quickly today because, there's pressure from the regulators. They want answers. The problem with that is you can't really shortcut stuff. And so, and now what it's forced us to do, which is what we have done, is we've taken a completely different approach, to doing this other than, that we did before, so in the beginning, before we even got to certain things in the investigative process, we went through this whole big machination. Now it's more of a, how do we use technology to kind of sift through vast amounts of data to get to something that, may indicate or prove or disprove an allegation. There's a whole theory that, you should never interview anybody unless you have, data or, something to put in front of them. A lot of these things are changing now because of the pressure put on us to get to these answers from a disclosure perspective. I will tell you this, I will never give up or compromise my reputation because, if I have imperfect information and somebody's really pushing me to make a decision, I will disclaim the living daylights out of that. But, at the end of the day, you have to do the right thing. And I think you need to go through a very thorough and detailed process. And that's where, the lawyers and the investigators are really getting pounded on. And I think, what while it may be good in theory, at the end of the day, in practice, it's really causing a little bit of consternation for us because of the pressure that's being put on us, not only by the regulators, but now, by the clients as well.
Karen, do you have a question or comment for Mike?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions actually, because now we're seeing the corporate enforcement policy on voluntary self-disclosure by the organization, the voluntary self-disclosure by individuals, and now this whistleblower program kind of not quite dovetailing with each other. So for an organization to try and address all of these in the same kind of context of an investigation, I think is extra challenging, not just from an internal strategy perspective, but also from who's going to report out rather than up. I guess I have two real questions. One is the whole whistleblower thing, and I know this is my broken record, but for God's sakes, internally we've got to rebrand that and not call it a whistleblower. Don't even put whistleblower in the mind of the employee. It gets right back to the heart of everything we've been talking about today, frankly, on investigations, which is, does an employee feel heard? Do they feel respected? Do they feel something's going to happen? Do they feel that there will not be negative consequences to themselves, but actually positive consequences to themselves? Are they going to be rewarded, not monetarily, but from the way they're viewed within the organization, and their opportunities there? That kind of whole loyalty question, which I still struggle with, but a whole other topic of conversation. So question number one for you, Michael, is what is the ability, and it really struck me when you said that if you are aware now of an internal investigation and now you see this personal benefit to reporting out because you've learned about this internally, how do you manage that within the course of an internal investigation without then creating a new risk that you may be taking actions which are seen as having a chilling effect on the ability to report out? So that's question number one. And on that VSD for individuals, I've struggled with this for a long time in those rare instances when you have senior executives implicated in a major potential misconduct, is how do you reassure them that you've got their back, even though they've got kind of personal exposure and liability? So two kind of different questions, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question because one of the things that's I think partially the DOJ was anticipating was this issue, and so the very senior executives, I think the CFO and the CEO, are actually excluded from eligibility. They can't avail themselves of this program, which I think was probably a wise decision. But I think overall, there's a tension there between when you're doing an investigation, especially dealing with executives, managers who are implicated, potentially implicated, right? There's a tension there because you're demanding their participation in the investigation and their cooperation. Most of the time, I don't want to say most of the time, oftentimes, it is against their best personal interest to cooperate because they may have criminal exposure involved if the allegations are substantiated. So it's a very difficult tension. And, especially as the DOJ has ramped up pressure on companies to, full cooperation means tell us who and how. All right. So we got to name names versus the old days where you could kind of say, yeah, we as a company did it, but we're not going to tell you who exactly was involved. So it does create a tension. It's a very difficult balance. I wish there was a one size fits all answer for it. It's not. I think it varies depending on the approach. Has to vary depending on the facts and circumstances and frankly the personalities of the individuals involved and the personality of the sort of company and its culture in general. To your first point, and I think your point about the rebranding whistleblower hotline is a good one, and frankly creating creating an environment internally where employees are just very comfortable that if they make a report internally, not only will it be handled appropriately, but I will be seen as helping the company. It will be looked at as positive on my resume. We talk a lot about retaliation, preventing retaliation, and for good reason. But there's a flip side to that as well, which is there should be a some sort of reward, even an intangible one, for employees who report internally and are ultimately helping the company uncover misconduct, right? So it's not just that they're not going to be retaliated against, but they're actually going to be rewarded, whether it goes in their performance evaluation. Some companies have actually established small monetary bonuses for allegations that are substantiated. But that is a cultural move that it's not an easy thing to do and takes years and years and years, as you might imagine. But the overlap of all of these things you mentioned, the corporate enforcement policy, the whistleblower program, these voluntary self-disclosure for individuals, to me, at the very top line, what it does, this is something that Jonathan was mentioning, it just places enormous pressure on the companies to do something and do it fast. And I think the DOJ recognizes that, especially with the voluntary disclosure program, but the whistleblower program and the voluntary disclosure program together. One of the things they mentioned is we know that companies in doing an analysis of whether they should self-disclose misconduct, we know one of the things that they're doing is assessing how likely it is we're going to find out from somewhere else. Something that Tom and I talk about often, right? That's a big part of that conversation. They're taking that and saying, we're going to shrink that. We're going to put those odds in our favor. It is now more likely, because of all these different things we're doing, it's more likely that somebody, if you don't tell us, company, somebody will. And I think that's going to be meaningful for companies in how they respond to these investigations.
Jonathan Marks, you have a question or comment for Mike?
No, I think Mike, I think you answered my question there with regards to, the fact that, there's just this balancing act, so to speak, and you have to kind of weigh the situation and evaluate each situation differently. But, if the odds of reporting are great, I've been in those conversations before where we're sitting down and we're going through sort of this, here's what we have, here's what we know, here's the alleged bad actors, here's the second ring or the periphery of potential bad actors, who else could possibly know about this? Could they have already reported? Is it we're on somebody's radar already? I mean, these are real conversations that are being had, in boardrooms around the globe. And if you think that I'm kidding, I'm not. But it's become very interesting. The one thing that I wanted to ask you though, Mike and Karen maybe, and even Matt and Tom, when you report an ethics violation, there are people out there that we all know and we've heard them speak and some of us have read their books. There is some form of sort of post-traumatic stress disorder that comes into play here. And so I often wonder, and I spoke about this, I did an ethics presentation for the ACFE this week, and I believe I mentioned this. I often wonder that in these ethics program, should somebody really employ, I hate to go back to, fantasy land here, but, if you go back and look at Bobby Axelrod's corporation and Billions, they had a psychologist on staff. And I often wonder if there was somebody there that somebody can go talk to, knowing that there be some confidentiality with that, it might diffuse some of what goes on in an organization, either from a fraud perspective or from, somebody who's has this great deal of trepidation to basically sit behind home plate and watch somebody coming around third base and not calling the play safe or out. And what I mean by that is, I mean, at some point it's really binary. It's either an issue or not an issue. And a lot of times people are afraid to say that this is an issue. And, maybe that would help or it wouldn't help. But, I've been bantering about this for years, and I often think that we have it all wrong.
While I'll caution anybody from using AXCAP as a model for an ethics or compliance program, I do absolutely think that's very interesting idea, and I think you're spot on in terms of the sort of trauma and carry-on effects of making an internal report can have, and I think thinking outside the box about how we address that is a really good idea.
Yeah, I have to say that it's, again, a question of resources, because I've always thought that all of the players in an investigation need ongoing support and counseling. And, you have to listen to them throughout the course of the investigation and then in the aftermath. Maybe nobody more so than the person or people who have been accused of the misconduct. And it just becomes a question of where your priorities lie and where can you spend your time. But story for another time. But I had a disastrous outcome with failure to do that very thing, and that still weighs on me. Frankly, I think some of the investigators could use some support and counseling as well.
Yeah, no, I think, Karen, I'll make this last comment. We can move on. I mean, I find myself lately, in the role of, Maggie Siff and AXCAP, trying to talk, and connect with folks and, make them understand, what it is or it's very interesting. They always say what makes a good forensic accountant. You have to understand auditing. You need to know a little bit about the law, and if you go around the wheel of skills and attributes, psychologist is definitely in there. And, again, I often wonder if we're not going back to fundamentals of the way this investigation process is really rolling out. If you look at the curriculums in colleges and universities, it's, accounting 1, accounting 2, accounting, maybe there should be something in there that really does talk about, the psychology of fraud and ethics and how to deal with that, and, how to identify certain things or be a good, I don't know. I'm just speculating at this point because I'm always trying to drive the profession forward. But I think the conversation is one that we could probably sit here all day and kind of, keep going on it.
Yeah, I love that, because, frankly, speaking up is a betrayal. It's either betrayal of the organization, it's a betrayal of your team, it's a betrayal of somebody or something that you're supposed to have a sense of loyalty to. So, yeah.
I learned a long time ago, the best lawyers were part father confessors. So with that, I cannot wait for this week's shout outs and rants. We'll keep the same order and I will bat fifth. So Matt Kelly, what you got for us this week?
Today, I'm going to start with some praise and then probably wander off into a rant by the time I'm done. But I am here to praise the Supreme Court, which is not something I really have done lately in the last couple of years with this court, for their ruling earlier this week upholding the funding structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on a 7-2 vote, rather decisive, that yes, the CFPB can get its budget as a percentage of the Federal Reserve's budget rather than an annual appropriation to Congress. That is not news. There are multiple agencies out there that get their funding in this same way. It always seemed to me to be a bit of a no-brainer that the CFPB can operate this way, and this case should never have reached here. Oddly enough, of course, it only reached this point because a bunch of right-wing people who don't like the regulations of the CFPB, this is the part where I veer into a rant, that they pushed this case, and it went nowhere in the district court, so they appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court, and they wound up with a bunch of Trump appointee judges to evaluate this. So you all know where that's going to go when you get Trump judges involved, is that the Trump judges said, well, of course this is unconstitutional, and therefore maybe the entire corpus of work for the last 13 years of the CFPB should go down the toilet, which would have been a complete bureaucratic and legal quagmire and a mess if that had happened. And the Supreme Court wisely said, this is also ridiculous. Of course, it is actually constitutional, and we do not need to invalidate 13 years worth of the CFPB's work. Really, what gets to me is that these right-wing groups don't like what the law allows a regulatory body to do. So then they try and attack the regulatory body from other directions under these flim-flam reasons about, is this constitutional funding or something like that? Like, give me a break. If you don't like what the CFPB is doing, then assemble a working majority in Congress to pass a law that changes what it does, which the right-wing people opposing the CFPB never did because they can't, and they all know it. Most people in this country like the idea that there are some curbs on predatory financial practices, and I get that compliance with the CFPB's rules can be a pain in the neck, but hey, that's the job. This is what we elected Congress to do. This is the law that they passed in 2010, and therefore it all flows from that. So, I suppose that what my real rant here is these continuing attacks on the government's ability to solve problems. And that seems to be the beef that these critics have. And enough. If you don't want the government to solve problems, put a bunch of people into Congress who then defang the federal government. That's fine. You can do that. This is a democracy. That's not what they do. They wind up trying to use Trump judges to see if they can dismantle everything and leave everybody else vulnerable. And enough. And when even this Supreme Court says enough, of course, the CFPB can stay. That really just says a lot about how weak this case is and the general lack of interest that this group has in solving the country's problems. That's all. I'm going to get off my soapbox.
All right. We have a very high bar set. Karen Moore, what do you got?
I've got flood sympathies going out. First to Texas, where, Texas is so big, but I heard flood and I immediately wanted to make sure Tom and his family were okay, and they are. But I want to talk about the flooding in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, where there are 500,000 people displaced, several hundred people dead, and untold numbers of people missing. And my shout out is going to go out to two rowers, Evaldo Matthias Becker and Pedro Tuchtenhagen, who have decided to drop out of the qualifying phase of their Olympic pitch in order to stay back and help out with flood victims and trying to find some of the missing people. I think the whole thing is made more poignant or maybe praiseworthy by the fact that in their category, the lightweight rowing category, this is their last chance at the Olympics. That category has been excluded as of the 2028 Olympics. So 2024 Paris was their last shot of bringing home a medal or just competing. So for people who have put Olympic preparation front and center for a long time and rowing at that level, to say, no, my country's more important, my country needs me. I really shout out to them and so many of the other, real heroes, noted and unnoted, who are stepping in difficult circumstances.
Jonathan Marks.
Bologna. Salami. Capicola. Roast beef. My shout out is to Dylan Beard on the Olympic theme, who is a Walmart deli counter employee who is going to be headed to the 2024 Summer Olympics. And Beard emerged as a surprise winner in the 60-meter hurdles at the Millrose Games in February. And it's really a great story. And I encourage you all out there to go read about it. And even more so when people found out about this gentleman and his level of work ethic and the like. And that's one of the reasons why it really hit me pretty hard. And I think he deserves a shout out. And this guy's working in Walmart slicing meats. And he also went and earned his master's degree in public health at Howard University. He's training for the Olympics. And so it's really an interesting story. But Beard was actually blown away when the Today Show's Craig Melvin presented him with a check from Walmart for $20,000 so his friends and family could support him as he makes his way to the Olympic trials. And I just think that that's just awesome. And so, to everyone involved in that and for recognizing this man's, zest for, competing and especially, working hard and his level of ethic. I just think it's remarkable. So a big, huge shout out to Dylan.
Mike DeBernardis, high bar, buddy.
I know. I'm gonna go with a quick shout out to my Washington Commanders, who have for the entirety of my adult life caused me nothing but anguish and pain and suffering, and I am absolutely getting ahead of myself, but am just after what looked like a strong and competent draft process, seemed to be running like a professional organization again. So I think talk about tone at the top. We could have many conversations about how the tone at the top of that organization has been affected, but that is I am optimistic for the first time in a long time. So shout out to the Commanders.
Go Birds.
Well, I won't start with Go Cowboys then. There's been so much this week that I could talk about. I could talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene complaining about the false eyelashes of another House member. I could read about Greg Abbott, who pardoned a convicted murderer who, with malice aforethought and announcing on social media he was going to kill a Black Lives Matter protester, drove directly into a crowd, stepped out of his car and shot one. I could rant about Justice Samuel Alito, who flew a Stop the Steal flag on January 6th from his house. But I'm going to shout out and rant to the city of Louisville because two things happened. The first was they released the video of the cab video of the driver who drove off the bridge over the Missouri River and hung there for an hour while she was rescued. Well, it turned out a car had veered into her lane, dodging another car who had stopped on the bridge, and the driver, one Sydney Thomas, avoided hitting any other cars while driving her 18-wheeler and crashing through the rail. So shout out to Sydney Thomas. But Louisville being Louisville, you got to bookend it with a rant. So today, at the start of the PGA, police officer Brian Gillis arrests the #1 golfer in the world, Scott Scheffler, for some sort of driving violation. And I have to read what he was charged with. Quote, damaged Detective Gillis uniform pants valued at approximately $80 beyond repair. So, City of Louisville welcoming the world's golfers to the PGA. What do? Well, let's arrest the #1 golfer in the world. Now, to Mr. Scheffler's credit, he is under par for his first round. So, what a great episode, guys. I can't thank you enough. Special shout out and thanks to Karen Moore and Mike DeBernardis for joining us, and can't wait to see what we come up with next time, guys.